Being creatively stuck can look like many things. Being creatively stuck can look like shame and doubt about the type of music that you like or how you might want to dress, like assuming people are going to think you're lame or even worse. Being creatively stuck can also look like being habituated to eat or watch or consume the same things over and over because maybe they're familiar, like a video game or a TV show. Being creatively stuck can look like painfully wrestling with yourself to start doing some music or art or a writing project or simply produce something like a craft that you might want to do. Being creatively stuck can also look like a deep longing to be more expressive and free in the world. And being creatively stuck can look like hating a job or a relationship or a living situation, but not really wanting to rock the boat about your own situation or change it. And sometimes with that last one, sometimes circumstance doesn't really allow for change in the moment, but that's really not what I'm describing. Stuck creatives can feel safe in stuckness, and that's really not criticism. That's just kind of how it is. That's what it was like for me. Being stuck in any of those examples can also be highly related to childhood trauma. Creativity is really a crucial part of the human experience, whether it manifests as the ability to create art or embrace what we like without shame, or the ability to use creative thinking to just simply enhance our lives. So embracing our creativity is really a beautiful process of self-discovery about truly knowing oneself. And despite the stuckness you might be experiencing, you can jumpstart a creative process and be successful in what you want to do. So ideally, that should be taking place in childhood expression. If we're truly safe to be able to play and express ourselves as children, and even have our parents be engaging in their own creativity and take interest in our own, if any of that makes sense. My ability to put out this video and to be comfortable on camera in a good enough way has been a really long process in healing creative wounding, as well as regular old childhood trauma, which I don't really kind of separate the two things. But without the work that I did on my childhood trauma and my creative recovery, I wouldn't have been able to really be able to do any of this. Whether it's doing psychology videos like I do, or musical shorts, or whatever I'm doing, I used to really be frozen and terrified about what people would think, to the point that I wouldn't even start any of this. And with help, I've been able to put myself out there, which used to be deeply terrifying. And I also think that that's really part of childhood trauma, is being seen. So being seen can really be the problem. Related to that, like most childhood trauma survivors, I grew up in the abuse, which was often about being seen in the wrong ways, or not being seen at all, like feeling invisible or feeling worthless as a child. For childhood trauma survivors, due to the nature of the family system and the community in which they're raised, a child's natural creative play and expression are often really attacked or dismissed or buried or neglected. Our creative longings usually become deeply pained and private to us, which makes really a lot of sense given how the world responded to us while we were going through childhood trauma. So I want to talk a little bit about neglect. And what might surprise you is I find neglect being the major culprit to deep issues around creativity and stuckness. Like having parents who not only weren't interested in their child's inner world, but also didn't express themselves from a creative place either. If not, they might have even loathed creative expression. Like expression or creativity is a threat somehow. It breaks rules, it challenges people, it challenges parents. From either the neglect or the direct criticism that we experience as kids, or both, we might have intense shame or self-doubt or stuckness about being creative for some of those reasons. This results in survivors making attempts at being creative, but it's too painful to keep an effort going. It can feel too exposing, even if no one has even seen what you wanted to share. Due to the neglect, it can feel re-traumatizing to even try to be creative, too exposing, like I said, where a big part of us might ask, what's the point if I'm just going to be ignored again or told that I'm not good enough? Hold on to that idea that I just said, because it's really like an inner child stuck place, which is really at the heart of this stuff. That inner child that I mentioned can also be an insidious critic. I don't really see them as separate between the inner child and the inner critic. It's often simply the internalized parent where our self-criticism comes from. That shoots down our attempts, and we can loathe ourselves for trying to be creative. And our internalized parent is the messages that we received and the beliefs about ourselves that we absorbed from a toxic parent or an abusive parent. Stating those things, even if the parent really isn't saying them or directly, it could really come from simply being ignored or being neglected. Neglect, when it comes from creativity, isn't just about not being seen. It's really about not being known. It's like another layer to this stuff. For example, I started playing drums at 11, and my father never said anything to me about my playing or progress or interest. It was like the drums didn't exist to him. Because usually a toxic parent often sees their child's interest as something that is in their way, or it's like a hassle to them. And if it isn't interesting to them or they can't use it in some way to their benefit, it's a burden. So in addition, the damage to our development due to childhood trauma neglect has a lot to do with magical thinking and self-blame, like how we deal with things. A 10-year-old who's, hypothetical here, a 10-year-old who joined the high school band, say at the start of the year, who had to leave a month into it because they still didn't have an instrument due to the parental substance abuse going on, that child might blame themselves for not getting it together enough and unfairly compare themselves to their peers. The child learns that creativity and doing what you want, that's for other kids. That's for other kids get to do that, and we're not all that important to do that kind of stuff. And I say it's mostly neglect, but it can also be really about damning criticism from a parent or hatred from a parent, or even highly manipulative stuff like, well, you're really good at drawing, so I don't think music will be your thing. When the reality, the manipulation behind that is music is a loud and messy thing and drawing is quiet and private, and it doesn't burden the parents. You kind of see where I'm going there. Or, what you want to explore as a kid doesn't fit into the abusive parent's role that they have for you. Like you're, in their mind, the perfect little church kid and a pointy neck metal guitar breaks up what you're providing to the parent in that role that you're being manipulated around. There are many different abusive scenarios about creativity. I'm just giving you some hypotheticals here. At the heart of that and all that neglect is really about not helping a child have a process of becoming themselves, and it's extremely wounding to not be allowed or encouraged to do that in a good enough way. It's really kind of like what we're talking about, like childhood development, becoming a person. Here are some examples of being stuck around creative expression. Keep thinking how these might be related to neglect in your own story. The first is really being highly self-critical during any time of self-expression, with like a marked negativity towards things like your doodles or singing in the shower, or even embracing some art and music that you like. There's some really strong self-hate and like filtering about all that stuff, where the inner child might say something like, who am I to think that I could ever sing? After trying a fun night of like karaoke and you had a shame attack afterward because you couldn't just allow the funness of it, like that critic really came up. And remember that internalized parent from what I said earlier. Another example is being overwhelmed for not really knowing how to start with creativity, like wanting to learn how to sing or find opportunities, and our inner child overthinks and goes too fast about how it works. Like they might assume you have to move to New York City before exploring that there's a voice teacher near you where you live in Iowa or something like that. Another example is buying materials for creative expression in an effort to power through and go for it, and then getting stuck with what to do with the materials. That can look like buying a keyboard or an outfit outside your comfort zone and then not being able to follow through with it due to overwhelm. Another example is setting yourself up for failure by judging yourself against advanced people. You start playing around with music or video software, and then you start unfairly comparing yourself to people who have been at it for like 10 years or more. Remember that example of the 10-year-old who couldn't get into band, that like hypothetical that I gave earlier, where they compared themselves with other kids and blamed themselves. Another example is getting overwhelmed due to not having direction or recognizing that there's a process to this stuff. Like after fooling around with watercolors or a keyboard, you get really discouraged for the lack of skills. And there's a missing part to our awareness that we just need a teaching resource, but our inner child is giving up for feeling like you should be able to figure it out on your own. That is such a little kid thing that little kids do, and I think that we're caught in that age frame of development. Another example is longing to try something like creativity, art, music, dance, writing, or even take a vacation, which is a creative thing, and becoming fearful about how it would work in context of your life or your relationships with others, and feeling shame because of that. Like, I'm a busy mom, it's wrong for me to want to take a dancing class. Remember what I said about burdening others. Another example is being able to make art or be creative, but the stuckness is around how painfully private it needs to be for you. You might have a masterpiece in your bedroom, but the inner child can't show it to anyone due to intense fear or feedback. But that's also incredibly lonely. and it still is partially wanting to share what you've made with the world. Remember what I said earlier about not being seen and neglect. I think that that's all a combination of it. Another concept I've liked to discuss about relevance of childhood trauma and creativity is that one occasion means many other things, meaning keep thinking of a bigger story around neglect. Related to those examples that I just gave, remember that childhood trauma is usually an ongoing experience that affects many things. Say you were told by a parent that you're not cut out for music only after playing violin for something like 2 weeks. But that kind of criticism tells a much bigger story and a more encompassing story than just that one exchange about the violin. In that example that I just gave about the violin being told you don't have innate talent after 2 weeks, that is abuse around not allowing for a process and being the ability to get good at something, where growing up is a whole process, learning something is a process, development is a process. And as a side note, toxic families don't even believe in the process around healing from abuse. When you're told just get over it, is it a good example of someone stating you shouldn't need a process? In the example of that violin thing, there are off expectations, like needing to be good at something just after 2 weeks. There's lack of empathy. There's unnecessary brutal honesty. Toxic families and toxic parents love to weaponize honesty, where a lot of creative wounding can come from that kind of stuff. And also a contempt for the child, as well as giving off this black and white worldview without any process. You're either good at it or you're not. You either have it or you don't. There are many things behind those kind of wounds and neglect. Also, try to think about neglect as having a parent totally ignorant to their role and responsibility to their child's development and personhood. And you might be currently thinking that being told you're not good at violin after 2 weeks might be kind of a little bit accuracy there because you weren't all that good and you might be a little bit confused. That's the internalized parent popping up if you have that thought. Like factually, 99% of everyone isn't going to be that great at violin after 2 weeks. But again, think of the word process and neglect in the internalized parent using abusive honesty instead of encouragement. That abuse of honesty can become internalized where like, yeah, shouldn't I be better at this by now? That kind of stuff. Also, again, there's way more under the surface to this hypothetical. One occurrence of a parent being insensitive around a violin or something like that, like in an off moment, doesn't mean that there's going to be childhood trauma, but that's not what we're talking about. These things are happening usually in context of ongoing emotional, physical, and sexual abuse, along with the neglect, which greatly impacts our sense of self and therefore our sense of creativity. Here's some about the importance of creativity, humanity, and development. From an early age, children in general operate within creativity as a way to connect and learn about the world. As adults, we don't really draw trains and moons or siblings or the house cat as a way to make sense about them the way we might do when we were 3 or 4. There is so much to play in mastery around the world around them by doing such drawings. Like a child is figuring out that trains go fast, clouds move slow, here is what they look like. Makes me think of the cave drawings of hunted animals done by early humans. Why did they do those drawings when seeking shelter thousands of years ago? There are theories that the medium of drawing on a cave wall pre-existed our ability to talk to each other about, say, the hunt or about survival. Art is so important to the human experience to the point that it was possibly our first language. In a Natural Geographic article that I found when I was putting together this video, linguists suggest that the cave drawings may have come from humans noticing animal sounds in the echo of the cave or the reverberation of the cave, which may have resulted in the spontaneity of drawing an animal on the wall because oral language hadn't been developed yet. Maybe that's how language started. I'll put the journal link in the description of this video for reference. So what I'm trying to say there is creativity and expression and connection and shared life leads to like essentially everything else potentially. Then think about how unnecessary and sad it is to be stuck when expression should be flowing from ourselves since it's part of our biological DNA and even how we function in the world. That can be complicated because a lot of our world, yes, is conforming, but we still are creative beings within that conforming kind of culture that we're in. So as a side note, some people just aren't that interested in being super creative, and that's really not a thing. Like, their expression of self just comes up in ways that are unique to them. This video isn't designed to shame you because you don't want to be like Renoir or David Bowie or something, but creativity comes in all kinds of mediums. Maybe organization is your creativity. Maybe problem solving at work is another person's. So who out there ever wondered if they could actually do something better at work from a systems perspective, but were afraid to bring it up? It's another example of being creatively stuck. But there's also work, how they operate as well in that. So how might we lose our natural innate ability to be creative in childhood and having shameful beliefs about taking risks and expressing ourselves in our adulthood? So these all range in severity from different family system types. The same stuff can happen in a quiet, shutdown family or a highly toxic family or a loudly abusive one. Here are some childhood trauma examples that lead to creative issues. One is in early childhood, parents, again, they're disinterested and dismissive of a child's playful inner world. Drawings, toys, ideas, interests are not mutually shared with the loving adult. A child's play, again, is an expression of self that needs to be seen and celebrated. Everyone out there, remember, like, wanting a parent to take interest and then you get shot down. That cuts deep. It stays with us. Another example is, like I said earlier, where toxic families will criticize a child for not being immediately amazing at something instead of allowing the child to be a beginner. Like we've already covered, well, you're clearly not symphony hall material or art school material, that kind of stuff. Another example is shame-based families often confuse artistic desires and efforts like music, art, or literature as self-involved and frivolous. What will the neighbors think if you're just some kind of bum comic book artist? Another example is part of abuse and dysfunction around creativity can be caused by parents operating in survival mode only. Immigrant or rigid families or socioeconomic issues in the family where they see no real value in the recreation of creativity and only operate in what's most acceptable and that's going to keep the family surviving. Work on becoming a high earner is the only valuable life course, and art and creativity threaten survival. Another example is toxic families who embrace religious fundamentalism view creativity as dangerous self-expression. The clothing, the thinking, the music, the literature must come from only one religious text, and any expression outside of that is probably evil. Sometimes another example is a family can be highly accomplished in creativity, but there isn't any teaching around it. They're just winners and losers in being creative, or some people have a highly creative parent, but they're a little bit narcissistic within that, or shut down or really distant or something like that. Often having a parent who is highly successful in art, but they're not guiding you about it. And there can be a lot of like in their shadow kind of stuff. Sometimes, put simply, for various reasons, that parents are threatened by things they don't understand. This is another example, and find safety in conformity, which often becomes abusive around children discovering who they are. You know, maybe you were that boy that didn't like G.I. Joe, but not like gender-specific things, which was threatening, and you became a source of family contempt and misunderstanding. Lastly, there can be that one art teacher, band leader, piano instructor, or whatever that can really cut some deep artistic wounds in a kid, which is also not unlike having abuse from siblings, where we can't really process without the context of how the parents helped you with that wound or responded to the abuser around that kind of creative wounding. That could have been made much better if there was parental response, or if they knew about it, or if they were healthy enough to do something and they knew about it. So what do we do? How do we get unstuck as creatives? Here are some ideas about creative recovery from childhood trauma survivors that I have. There are 3 of them. One is normalize vulnerability. The next is lower your expectations. And the third one is battle childhood trauma beliefs. They're all rooted in inner child work and looking at child development. And I'll also be providing you with some journal prompts later. So here goes. Number 1, normalize vulnerability. I wish I could remember where I read this, but back in the day, rock stars from the 60s, 70s, and 80s, or somebody like John Lennon or Dylan or whoever, there was this running joke around sort of songwriters that they hated playing their songs for other high caliber songwriters or listening to them together. Not just Dylan and Lennon, but in general, they didn't like showing their work to their peers. Why? Is because, I'm not saying all of them, but to be creative is to be vulnerable no matter what level you're at. It's pretty human. We tend to think that being creative doesn't come with a standard, difficult, laboring vulnerability or pain to it when it really does. Childhood trauma or not, the artist is faced with the challenge of breaking through themselves, which is vulnerable and challenging on many levels. This is a useful paradox to getting unstuck. What I mean by this is that it's vulnerable to start a new business, a creative process. It's vulnerable to sell your art, a creative process. It's vulnerable even if you're massively successful. Creating is a laborious, discovering, painful, and extremely rewarding process at times. Related to that, I'm not to the level of those songwriters, but I struggle in making these videos. I often dread having this camera on me a little bit, but just because I feel that, and it doesn't mean though that I'm stuck. Like I can do them, I get through them. Part of me enjoys the process and the product, but it's often laborious and uncomfortable. It's not always a cakewalk. Lastly, to our inner child who is hypervigilant about security, we often don't want to take the risk of putting ourselves out there and be seen. We can do it, but my point is about the vulnerability piece is it's really rewarding, but it's vulnerable. It's a lot of work. And I think we might have some magical thinking that for those who can do it, it's not in some way. Moving on to number 2 is lower your expectations. While I hate that phrase because it sounds disappointing, like womp womp, our inner children really get caught up in having big expectations on themselves and creativity, which kills process. Are they going to like it is an expectation thought. Is it going to be perfect is another one. Another way to frame this one is to try to do little things or create or work on something and enjoy your process, because the process is for you, but don't get attached to the outcomes. We can get attached to the idea of being accomplished, but we have to lower our expectations at the speed to which we want that accomplishment to happen. Like it's not going fast enough for us. We can get attached to the idea of we should be having good performances without spending a lot of time on stage. Not being a mess on stage, if your creativity is about performing, can take a really long time. And like the first one, it's always a vulnerable experience to be on the stage so you can gradually get more comfortable in around the vulnerability. And it's not just about performing on stage, but like putting one's art or stuff out there. This can be anything from selling stuff online to simply sharing some music that you like with somebody. We have to lower our expectations. The advice here is to enjoy the process of doing and self-discovery more than getting caught up in the expectations around your final product and how people are going to respond to it. Let's say even if a blocked creative is in a situation where they're asked to draw something with their kids or something like that, or a fun paint night or something like that, something really low-key. They might get caught up in the expectations, which might look like, what are the rules? What do you mean just draw an elephant? I need more explicit instructions than that. I'm not criticizing the person caught up in that. They might go into a little bit of an emergency because their trauma thinking is around expectations. Like, what do I have to do so people aren't going to make fun of me? Those are expectations. It's also fear, and I get that as well. It's all about risk-taking, which is often triggering for childhood trauma survivors who tend to be hypervigilant about security and their safety. I was. Again, our inner child can get caught up and attached to the outcome of people liking things that we like or that we're putting out, and maybe they may not like those things so much, which is going to be okay. Again, that's a part of the vulnerability. And of course, we want people to like it or to be thought of as putting out something that is thought-provoking. But we can't be so driven by that expectation, because that's going to prevent us from our process, from our trying, from our own enjoyment of it. The third part is to battle your childhood trauma beliefs around creativity. These are also examples of how kids actually really think, which is another layer to the wounds. Like a 4-year-old who's drawing and they're drawing at the table with their 8-year-old is going to get really upset that they can't draw like the 8-year-old. So here are those beliefs. If I'm not amazing at it at first, why bother? Feedback is always humiliating. I can't handle it. Another is being creative feels out of control. Another is work and survival always come first. Playing is bad. Another is I'm not going to even start if I can't tell if it's going to be good ahead of time. Another is, what do I know about creating? You have to be an expert to do that. Another is being creative takes years of instruction and materials to even start. Another is people are never honest about what I create. They always believe it's crap. and they're just being nice to me. Notice how many of those are outcome-based, like in the expectations we covered in number 2, where children and wounded inner children tend to think in absolutes, and they tend to think in black and white thinking. Like, I'm not going to start doing art even if I want to, unless it's going to look like Michelangelo's art immediately. That expectation is needing to end up like a master's work up front without any process. Here are some journal prompts that will explore these childhood trauma beliefs. And I'll put these in the description of the video so you can find them. These will help kind of look at where these beliefs might come from and maybe how to parent the inner child around them. Here's journal prompt number 1. What are some patterns and stuck places that you have about being more creative? Things like, do you have false starts? Write about that. Are you really afraid of showing people your interest in your work? Write about it. Have you longed to do something but can never really bring yourself to do that? Write out several paragraphs around these stuck places and feelings, and be sure to include the fear of what you think is going to happen if you end up doing something creative or show somebody. Think of that over the course of your lifetime, because it may change over the course of your lifetime. The second journal prompt is, what are some trauma memories you have or parental dynamics you experience that are painful around creativity? Do you remember times where you really got shot down and your creative heart had to go underground? Be specific and write a couple paragraphs. Here are some lead-in examples. Like, my mother would just say, okay, when I showed her my early drawings. There was no love, no energy or feedback, and I stopped because it felt like I was doing something bad and she was just being nice by not telling me I was stupid. Another is, as a kid, I started playing this rock band in high school, and one kid said I sucked at guitar and should really play bass, so I did, but I hated it. Like that kind of stuff. The third journal prompt is, how does your family view artists? How does it affect your creativity? How does your family view you as a potential creative? Remember thinking about the internalized parent. Some more lead-in questions there was a sibling assigned the role as being the creative one and you weren't? Are artists viewed in your family as frivolous losers who will always be poor? Is art and creativity a threat or something so foreign to them because they're really shut down and kind of one-dimensional, meaning your family? The fourth journal prompt is, what is your inner narrative around trying to be creative? Even if that's just a painting night with your kids or a friend or somebody like that, what does your inner child believe about what is good enough and just playing around with painting in a situation like that? Pay attention to whatever comes up. Even if your inner child feels like it's a waste of time, why do they feel like it's a waste of time? There's often, to inner children, more important things to do, like that kind of energy, for childhood trauma survivors around creativity, and that may tell a story about your family. The fifth journal prompt is, what is it that you want to try to do, but you feel really stuck around? Like, you would like to start a blog or social media page on an idea or a topic, take a dance class, embrace a part of yourself that you kind of hide, do karaoke without having a shame attack, go get a tattoo, learn to really draw or paint or write or do music, or start a small business within your interest. Instead of the sad feelings around those things, can they be turned into little goals or dreams that you have or that you're working towards? So it's shifting a mindset from something that's just like, oh, I hate that I even think about those things, instead of turning it into, I want to work towards those. It's a dream. I want to honor a dream that I have. Can you work towards getting that tattoo because it has meaning to you in a symbolic way into your spirit somehow? Can you write that song that's on your mind or want to express yourself, or make the painting because you're working through something as a person? Like, using those mediums to chisel away at something you're working towards, instead of being focused on like the expectation of it, the productivity of it, or how it's going to be received. Can you write the essay and get it out there somewhere? That's going to be about taking a risk and being vulnerable. What's good about being vulnerable is we have to embrace the vulnerability and do some healing around that to be able to put ourselves out there. So it's the practice of claiming your humanity while not being so neurotic about what a stranger thinks. That might contradict some things that I said earlier, but you're doing it for you and it's around your process of self-discovery, which we're not allowed to have in a toxic family. Here are some resources, and the two of these work really well together. The first is a inner child parenting course that you can find on my website. You can find it right up here. The course is about learning how to dialogue between your dominant hand and your non-dominant hand on paper to reparent the inner child and have conversations around the trauma, the reparenting, even creativity. Using our non-dominant hand to represent the inner child, I'm left-handed, is like having a conversation with our subconscious. That part of us is also our creative spirit that went underground and got repressed. Dialoguing is the major tool that I use in the childhood trauma work that I do, and the tool is amazing at helping us look at the fears, the risk-taking, the triggers. How is it related to childhood about putting yourself out there? Why is it so scary? Again, you can find the link up here, and I'll also put in a discount code for this course in the description of this video. As this video ages, that code might not be available, just FYI. The other resource I have is The Artist Way by Julie Cameron. This course book is really the book that helped me get unstuck, along with the combination of dialoguing while I was doing my childhood trauma work. It's really the best self-help book that I know of because it's action-oriented and not just educational. It's the best resource that I know of for becoming creatively unstuck, as it's very inner child based in the discussions around artistic wounds. And this is, I believe, it's a week-based course that you kind of do, and it's really interesting with stuff like getting off of media, really focusing on spending time with your creative heart. I can't say enough good things about it. I'll have the link in the description of this video. Some final thoughts. Lastly, about these ideas, one of my thoughts about the creativity is whatever you want to pursue is for you. More so than putting something out there in the world and wanting to be seen as cool or interesting. We all want that. That's like healthy ego stuff. The creative process and putting out something is really for you, for doing something that tears down your protective shell even more, and you're more discovering who you are. And again, as a side note, not everybody is drawn to be creative, and it could be one's personality. It doesn't have to be a symptom of trauma. The topic in these journal prompts is really for those survivors who long to be creative and can't bring themselves to kind of get there. Keep thinking about the word process. It's been a couple decades since I started dialoguing with my inner child when I was doing childhood trauma work and also doing the Artist Way at the same time. And I had really good results immediately with both of those things. In those early years, I could kind of write songs or do the elements of that. A couple years later, I could put a band together. A year later from that, I could kind of put an album together. So it's like building upon experiences. That is a process. I'm trying to say that a victory in getting unstuck leads to more victories down the road, but it's all going to be vulnerable, which is a good thing. And I'm at a point where I can put out these videos, and if they do well, fantastic. If it bombs, I'll be disappointed, but not devastated in the way I used to be when my trauma ruled my creativity. Not everything is going to be a viral video. Not every song is going to be your best work, but it leads to bigger and better things. And lastly, creative recovery is really another piece that helps us individuate, become our own person, which is complicated for childhood trauma survivors because the messages we received and we've had to recover from are really about not becoming our own person, not becoming a person, or even being respected as a person. So I would love to hear about your process. I would love to hear about what you would like to do and what you would like to work towards in terms of creativity, and share about some stuck places and share about your progress in the comments. I would love to hear from you. And as always, may you be filled with loving kindness. May you be well. May you be peaceful and at ease, and may you be joyous. And I will see you next time. Take care.